We are often conditioned to think that environmentalism and the working class exist as opposing forces. In reality, however, we can trace the roots of environmentalism as we know it to the efforts of working class people, indigenous people, and unions who protested the systems of power that created and perpetuated our climate crisis, and then leveraged their power as a collective to hold those forces accountable by forcing them to listen. This can seem unimaginable now, where climate action is often painted as an inevitable hit to jobs, to workers, and to communities that are built around things like fossil fuels and industrialization. But what if environmental efforts could come from collaboration with workers, or even from the workers themselves? Would this seeming dichotomy of the working class versus the climate crisis still exist in such extremes? We don't have to imagine what this would look like. In 1965, Anthony, known as Tony Mizaki, a worker of a Long Island cosmetics factory where he became president of his oil, chemical, and atomic workers union, was then appointed citizenship legislative director of that same union. In this role, he discovered just how deep the unregulated toxicity and violations of health and safety went that workers would face on a regular basis. Through this, he started the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, of 1970. But Mazzocchi knew that issues of workers' health and safety went beyond this immediate change in legislation. Mazzocchi became the first union activist to unite with environmentalists of the 1960s and 70s in the passing of the Clean Air Act. Mazzocchi therefore didn't have to work against a divide between chemical workers and environmentalists because he instead proved that the existence of one didn't make sense. He emphasized the dangers of the United States and developed world's increased focus on unregulated economic growth through mass consumerism in the form of major industrialization. He said essentially that as capitalist demand needs to be met with a limitless supply, that this productivity comes at expense of the workers.
It should be a fundamental right for any human being to be able to produce a product without putting a piece of his life in that product.
Mazzocchi wanted to show that disease, cancers, and other health issues were endemic to this working system rather than outliers of it. As awareness grew in the late 60s and 70s of the harmful effects that small amounts of pesticides and other chemicals used in industry, Mazzocchi wanted to make it clear that this was having a much larger and often fatal effect on the workers.
Meantime, they're emitting very caustic substances and very polluting substances, which of course find their way through the community. The community subsidized that operation by virtue of the fact that they have increased morbidity and mortality in the community. Those death certificates are a subsidy for industry.
But working class people did not just create initiatives to protect people from a changing environment. They also made strides in protecting the environment from a changing public as well. In the 1970s in Australia, there was a wave of what we now refer to as the green bans. Conceptualized by the Builders Labourers Federation, or the BLF union, which formed in the boom and bust period of mass development in Australia, green bans were union strikes on construction, on work that they deemed was environmentally and socially destructive. Their policy was simple. Every ban had to be requested and supported by local communities and had to be passed by a general meeting of the builders' laborers. This could be 1,000+ members at meetings. They started by physically defending Kelly's Bush, when no developers, government, or unions would commit to saving the only remaining national bushland on the Parramatta River, which was in the Sydney Harbour. And they continued to expand as they gained powers and numbers. For example, they refused working on the Sydney Opera House, on the Brian Board and Victoria Market development. There was a constant forum of idea exchange and education in these unions, as more progressive causes became their focus. They fought for LGBTQ rights, for women's rights and indigenous rights by leveraging their collective power and collaborative allyship. They saw that corporations wanted to build an inaccessible future, but they would be doing the actual construction. One of the most prominent leaders of the BLF was Kevin Cook. a Wandanian and Yuan man, who led the union into solidarity and support with the decolonization efforts in Australia and successfully defended Redfern, or the bloc, through a green ban, resulting in a housing co-op for the Indigenous community. The green ban showed that environmental action did not need to happen in spite of workers' interests, but rather because of them. That workers' interests involved political, social, and environmental activism. Unions, in this way, could be protests. They wouldn't just challenge capitalistic development, but rather threaten it as well. This idea of unification as a threat came to a major head in the late 80s and 90s in the California Redwood Protests run by experienced labor organizer, activist, and carpenter Judi Bari.
They're making it really easy for us to form an alliance with the loggers and mill workers because they are absolutely the crassest company I've ever seen. And the latest thing they're doing, they've shut down 5 mills this year, Potter Valley Mill being one of them. And they just announced that they're opening 12 new mills in Ensenada, Mexico, where they can pay the workers $1.50 an hour. They busted the union in Mendocino County years ago, but I guess that wasn't enough. And so they're going to be taking the last of the redwoods on the north coast and shipping them to Mexico to be processed and sold in Southern California. So this is a song I wrote for my favorite company. You can say, help come in on the chorus, it's only one word.
Bari led sawmill workers, loggers, and other lumber workers unions alongside Earth First environmentalists and the Cajo Indigenous Nation against a rapid deforestation of Northern California redwoods. She adamantly denounced action that would sabotage or endanger workers and fought to maintain any alliances of workers against corporations at all costs. However, on May 24, 1990, leading up to one of Earth First's most publicized campaigns, Redwood Summer, Bari and fellow activist Daryl Charney survived a car bombing assassination attempt. Yet, in the aftermath, they were subsequently arrested under suspicion of being behind it. This case is not just about me or Daryl or Earth First, Judi said. This case is about the rights of all political activists to engage in dissent without having to fear the government's secret police. Judi and Earth First were subsequently labeled as eco-terrorists. They had to start defending their reputation rather than their causes. Because of this, Bari launched her own investigation into the event, finding hidden police evidence photos of the bombing that showed evidence of planned attack contrary to what had been brought forward against her in court. After her findings went public, Bari was quoted saying, "The FBI should find that bomber and fire him." Despite this, Bari and Earth First went on to stop the logging of Headwaters Forest. A timber harvest plant was denied on the 3,000 acres of old-growth forest that it required. But so much of the damage of media rhetoric and unchecked law enforcement had already been done. A legacy against union, environmental, and political activists we still experience today. In a time of climate crisis, interests and allyship can be difficult to untangle. One issue is often presented as needing to trump the other. This creates an impossible problem. There seems to be no one threat to target, so any opposition becomes one. We are therefore made to think that working class interests and the concerns of environmentalists are thus incompatible and must manifest in these ultimatums of us or them. We've seen this with Keystone Pipeline and the divestment of coal. This comes hand in hand with what Michael F. Manatees, professor of social sciences, environmental studies at Yale University, calls a sort of individualism of environmentalism, where someone's desire to act on the climate crisis gets focused into individual actions, like riding a bike or recycling. And while this isn't necessarily an issue, it can pacify people from acting on political and social actions. This, paired with the opposition of working class and environmentalism, both prevent work that would target the causes of climate change, like capitalism or corruption, because both limit a collective's potential into a single interest. We aren't just pitting two sides against each other, but rather constructing the sides in the first place. In the end, it only serves the corporations that profit off of environmental destruction, regardless of what action is taken. But Mazzocchi showed us that these were fallacies of deception. The BLF proved that point with their green bans, and Judi Bari faced the consequences of when those in power recognized that same truth. In a way, we can look at it like this. Workers do not have to serve under the power of corporations that employ them, but rather they can identify that their collective power trumps a corporation's power to subject them. They can, in turn, use that to not only change their work environment through efforts like OSHA, but go beyond that to the social, political, and physical environments that surround them as well.
I mean, you join a union mostly, and it was like an insurance company, and at best it was a good insurance company. Basically, your wages and conditions would be protected, safety would be addressed, so you went home in the same condition you arrived in the morning. But to join a union that had a leadership that was concerned about a better world, not just a bigger share of this one, that was, especially for a kid like me and the others like me who became my mates and my comrades, it was life-changing. When we look back at the green bans, and we look back now, what we see is, as I said at the outset, you see workers taking the decisions about where we work and where we live, and demanding that through our use of industrial power. And of course, that's why the union had to go. That's why it had to be smashed, because it was challenging capitalism.
It's easy to say that the resolution of this is a pivot to a sort of green capitalism. But as the past has shown us, this could just be addressing the tip of a very deep and insidious iceberg, allowing all other underlying issues to remain intact. But what does this look like in practice and not just theory? A great way to think about this comes from a group of workers active in the industrial district of Porto Marghera in Venice, where they began to theorize noxiousness. This idea encapsulates more than what we just think as traditionally noxious. Chemical exposure, like Mazzocchi was fighting, or environmental destruction, like the green bans or Judi Bari were working against. But in this context, noxiousness is distinguished as a capitalist mechanism and not just a product of it. Therefore, if we try to address this problem by doing things like bribing workers by increasing compensation for, as Mazzocchi said, putting a piece of their life into the products they produce, it just encourages work that will further harm themselves and destroy the environment around them. So you have to go beyond that. You have to see wage increases for wage increases' sake. We have to address extreme disparities of pay grades. We have to look at the pace of work and what is demanded of people. What we include is working time. What we include is working hours. To put it simply, any specific struggle over environmental noxiousness is meaningful only if it is connected to a wider battle against the noxiousness of the capitalist organization of work. We can't keep accepting this dichotomy of workers against the environment as a given, because we know there can not only be unity between these two forces, but rather complete integration of them. And that is working class history.